What if the one person who could unlock a little girl's voice was a stranger the world told her to ignore? A millionaire's daughter hadn't spoken a single word in 6 long years. Doctors failed. Therapists gave up. Millions of dollars bought nothing but silence. But one rainy morning, a black single dad who collected trash did the impossible. Keep watching, because this true story will break your heart, then put it back together. The rain had stopped, but the city hadn't caught its breath yet. On Eastern Avenue, under a gray sky that smelled of thunder, Evelyn Hart, the most powerful woman in Boston, stood face to face with a man in an orange sanitation vest, Caleb Turner. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not in front of her mansion. Not speaking to her daughter. But somehow, in a few quiet moments, he had done what doctors, therapists, and millions of dollars could not. He made her little girl feel safe. "Who do you think you are?" Evelyn's voice trembled with fury. Caleb met her eyes, calm as a man who'd seen too much to be shaken. "I don't need to understand her," he said softly. "I just need to listen." That day, a war began. Not of pride, but of silence. What if the cure to silence isn't found in science, but in the heart of someone who truly listens? Evelyn Hart woke before dawn, as she always did. Sleep never stayed long in her glass-walled penthouse above the harbor. She would open her eyes to the same silence that filled every room. Expensive, sterile, immaculate. Her first breath was always for her daughter, Leah. For 6 years, the girl had not spoken a single word. Evelyn's mornings began with ritual precision. French press, coffee, email alerts, and the constant hum of markets opening across the world. But before all that, she would pause outside Leah's door. Ear against the wood, listening, hoping. Sometimes she thought she heard a whisper, a sigh maybe. But it was always the house breathing, not her child. Leah slept, curled around a faded toy fox. The last thing her father had given her before the accident. Evelyn whispered, "Today will be different," though she never believed it. Across the city, the sun rose over cracked windows and rusted rooftops. Caleb Turner flipped pancakes in a tiny kitchen that smelled of coffee and resilience. His son Noah, 12 years old and already too tall for the kitchen table, grinned sleepily as syrup poured over the plate. "Best pancakes in Boston," Noah said with mock seriousness. Caleb smiled. "That's because they're made with pure exhaustion and love." Laughter filled the apartment. The kind that made walls feel less thin. Caleb had learned early that life didn't owe him comfort. He'd once studied music at Berkeley. Back when dreams fit inside guitar strings and rent didn't kill them. Then life happened. A lost wife, unpaid bills, and a little boy who needed more than songs. Now he drove garbage routes at dawn, collected what others threw away, and somehow still found beauty in it. 2 worlds. One wrapped in marble, one in dust. Evelyn's wealth could silence cities. Caleb's warmth could calm storms. Neither knew the other existed. Not yet. But fate was already building its quiet bridge. Before the silence, there was music. A home filled with laughter. And a little girl who sang along to her father's piano. Evelyn used to watch them, husband and daughter, spinning in the living room while sunlight turned dust into gold. Back then, she believed love was permanent. That belief died on a rain-slick road 6 years ago. The car crash came without warning. Headlights, a scream, and then nothing but glass and silence. When she woke in the hospital, she learned her husband was gone. And her daughter, once so bright, hadn't spoken a word since. Doctors called it selective mutism, a trauma response. Therapists called it curable. Evelyn called it her punishment. She threw herself into work. 14-hour days, $12 million mergers. Anything to drown the memory. At night, she'd sit outside Leah's room, clutching a mug of cold coffee, watching shadows move under the door. Sometimes she'd whisper, "Say something, baby," knowing the only answer would be silence. The kind that cuts deeper than words ever could. Across town, Caleb Turner's silence came differently. Not from trauma, but choice. He'd grown up on the same streets that forgot people like him existed. Music had been his way out. A guitar bought from a pawn shop. Fingers bleeding on cheap strings. He made it into college, made it to the stage. Then came Rachel, the woman who sang harmony to his melody. They built a life out of small joys. One-bedroom apartments, borrowed amps. Late-night promises whispered over second-hand wine. But cancer doesn't care about harmony. When it came for Rachel, it came fast. Hospitals, bills, hope shrinking by the hour. Caleb sold everything. The guitar, the amp, even their wedding rings. To buy time he couldn't afford. When the music stopped, he buried her with silence. And the day Noah asked, "Will Mommy still hear us if we sing?" Caleb could only nod, because his voice wouldn't come. He stopped playing after that. Started collecting trash instead. Not because it was easy, but because it was quiet. Because broken things, in some strange way, made sense to him now. They didn't ask to be fixed. They just needed to be seen. Evelyn and Caleb would never have met. Not in the natural order of their worlds. But pain has its own geometry. It bends paths until they touch. It began on a Monday morning. Leah stood by the mansion's iron gate, waiting for the school's shuttle that never came. Caleb's truck rumbled up the hill, stopping to collect the bins that lined her street. He saw her standing there, barefoot on the cobblestones. Hair tangled from sleep, eyes wide but distant. He waved gently, the way one does to a frightened bird. She didn't wave back, but she didn't run either. Just watched him work, methodical, calm, unbothered by the judgment of passing cars. Later that day, Evelyn came home early. The housekeeper mentioned something odd. "Your daughter smiled, ma'am, at the garbage man." Evelyn froze mid-step, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Leah hadn't smiled at anyone in years. She told herself it was nothing. Coincidence. Curiosity. But that night, when she checked the security cameras, she saw it. Her silent child watching a man who hummed while lifting other people's trash. And smiling like she used to when her father played piano. For the first time in 6 years, Evelyn felt something stir. Not hope, not yet. Just the faint, terrifying sound of her own heart remembering how to listen. The next morning, the sun rose pale and thin over Beacon Hill. Evelyn's mansion glowed in muted gold. The kind of beauty that costs more than comfort. A new crew was scheduled to clean the service road. And among them was Caleb Turner. He didn't want the assignment. He didn't belong in neighborhoods where silence came with price tags. But work was work, and trash was trash. He moved carefully along the marble driveway, collecting bags lined with luxury logos. The remains of a life too rich to notice itself. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her again. Leah. She was sitting on the curb in a white dress, tracing circles in chalk. A single shoe missing. He froze, unsure if approaching would frighten her. Then he remembered his wife's voice. "Some people don't need answers, Caleb. They need calm." So he knelt, not too close, and began humming softly while picking up glass from a broken vase near the hedge. The melody was simple, something he used to play for Noah as a baby. A lullaby without words. Leah stopped drawing. Her eyes followed the sound, curious. When he finished, she placed a small pebble beside him, as if in thanks. Then walked back inside. For Caleb, that was enough. For Evelyn, it was an intrusion. By evening, whispers spread through the staff like perfume in the hallways. "The garbage man talked to the child. Mrs. Hart won't like that," Evelyn found out during a conference call. Her assistant mentioned it offhandedly. A note from security about an unauthorized interaction. The words hit her like a slap. She ended the call without apology. Marched outside, and found the man still working at the end of her driveway. "Excuse me," she said sharply. Caleb straightened, his hands dusty, his vest bright against the marble background. "Yes, ma'am." Her tone cut like winter air. "Did you speak to my daughter?" He blinked, surprised by the question's edge. I didn't speak, he said carefully. She was drawing. I just made sure she was safe. She doesn't need your concern. I didn't mean harm, ma'am. I was just. She stepped closer, voice trembling between anger and fear. My daughter has been through enough. The last thing she needs is. She hesitated, searching for the right word, but finding the cruel one first. A distraction? The air stiffened. He looked at her. Really looked. And for a moment she felt naked under that quiet, steady gaze. Then he said simply, Sometimes distractions are what keep us alive. That sentence cracked something in her, a soundless fracture. She dismissed him on the spot. Later that night, Evelyn sat in her office staring at the camera footage again. Frame by frame, she watched her daughter walk toward the garbage man. The way she tilted her head, the way she smiled. She replayed it over and over until the tears finally came. Silent, furious, unstoppable. How could a stranger covered in dust reach her child when she couldn't? Across town, Caleb packed up his tools. The foreman's voice had been cold. Mrs. Hart called. You're off that route starting tomorrow. He didn't argue. Pride didn't pay bills. But as he sat in his truck, he noticed something wedged behind the seat. A tiny piece of chalk. White, smooth, curved like a crescent moon. He didn't remember putting it there. And yet he smiled, because he knew exactly who did. The next morning, the mansion was quiet again. No laughter, no humming, no chalk drawings on the pavement. Just a little girl standing by the window, eyes fixed on an empty street. The maid came in quietly. Breakfast, Miss Leia? The child didn't respond. But she reached into her pocket, pulled out a single piece of chalk, and held it tight. Downstairs, Evelyn signed papers she didn't read. Approved deals she didn't feel. Her reflection in the glass wall looked like a ghost. Elegant, efficient, untouchable. But inside, something restless had begun to stir. The house felt heavier without that quiet melody drifting from the gate. Sometimes silence doesn't mean peace. It means something is missing. The first snow of winter fell without sound. Thin flakes drifted over the harbor, coating the city in a soft, forgiving white. It was on that morning that Evelyn Hart made a decision that frightened her more than any boardroom or press conference ever had. She would find him. The man her pride had driven away. She only had a name from an invoice, Caleb Turner, and an address from the sanitation department that smelled faintly of coffee and cheap printer ink. It led her to Westboro Street, where houses leaned into each other like old friends trying to stay warm. When Caleb opened the door, he looked surprised, but not shocked. Maybe he had expected this. Maybe hope had never quite died. Mrs. Hart, he said carefully. You're far from Beacon Hill. I know. Her voice trembled slightly, softer than the woman who once commanded skyscrapers. I came because I owe you an apology. He said nothing. Just stepped aside and let her in. The apartment was small but alive. A guitar in the corner, a wall covered in Noah's school drawings, and the faint smell of pancakes lingering in the air. Evelyn looked around, her designer heels out of place against the worn floorboards. Your home is warm, she said. Not much, but it's honest, he replied. Noah peeked from the kitchen, curiosity glowing in his eyes. Dad, is that? It's fine, son, Caleb said gently. Go finish your homework. Evelyn hesitated, then pulled a small box from her coat pocket. Inside was the piece of chalk. She left this in your truck, she whispered. He smiled faintly, eyes softening. I figured it was her way of saying thank you. Then, after a pause, how is she? Evelyn swallowed hard. Quiet. Always quiet. He walked to the corner, lifted the old guitar, and strummed a single chord. It hung in the air like light on glass. She doesn't need talking, Mrs. Hart. She needs sound she can feel. Evelyn frowned. I don't understand. He looked at her gently. You will. 2 days later, Caleb stood at the gates of the Hart mansion once more. Not as a worker, but as a guest. He carried a small wooden instrument case. Evelyn led him through the marble halls to Leia's room. The girl sat by the window, eyes fixed on the falling snow. When she saw him, her hand tightened on the windowsill, then relaxed. Recognition without surprise, as if she had been waiting. Caleb didn't speak. He simply opened the case and took out a small scarred guitar. The same one he once sold, now bought back after years of overtime. He tuned it slowly, softly. The sound was fragile, almost like breath. He began to play, not a song, but a memory. Notes simple enough for a child to follow, warm enough to melt the air between them. Leia's eyes widened. She stood, bare feet on the rug, and walked closer. Her fingers brushed the vibrating string. The sound hummed through her palm, up her arm, into her chest. Her lips parted, but no word came. Just a small exhale that almost sounded like wonder. Evelyn covered her mouth to keep from sobbing. Caleb smiled without looking up. "She can hear it," he whispered. "Just not the way we do." When the song ended, the room stayed alive with its echo. Leia knelt, took the chalk from his pocket, and drew a single line on the wooden floor. A wave, the shape of sound itself. Then she looked at her mother for the first time in years. "Music," she said softly. It was one word. One miracle. And Evelyn fell to her knees as if her body couldn't hold the weight of joy. The days that followed felt different. The house was no longer silent. It breathed. Caleb returned often, sometimes to teach Leia how to feel rhythm. Sometimes just to sit in the same room and listen to the hum of life returning. Evelyn began to laugh again, quietly at first, like a forgotten song. One evening she found Caleb in the garden mending an old string on the guitar. "You never told me," she said, "that you were a musician." He smiled faintly. "Was. Long time ago." "What happened?" "Life." Then, quieter, "I stopped listening." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You gave my daughter her voice." He shook his head. "She already had it. She just needed someone to hear it." The moonlight turned his words silver. And for the first time since the accident, Evelyn didn't feel broken. She felt human. A year later, the city knew a different kind of music. The old warehouse on Dockside Avenue had been reborn into something the world didn't have a name for yet. A sanctuary made of wood, light, and silence. They called it the listening room. No grand signs, no gala opening. Just a small engraved plaque at the entrance. "For those who speak in ways the world forgot to hear." Inside, the air hummed with warmth, laughter, faint melodies. The rhythm of feet tapping unevenly but joyfully. Children who had once been silent now played instruments, with fingers that learned to trust again. And in the front row, Evelyn Hart sat motionless, a hand pressed over her heart, as she watched her daughter take the stage. Leia wore a pale blue dress and no shoes. Her feet brushed the wooden floor like she belonged to it. Beside her stood Caleb, guitar in hand, waiting not as teacher, not as savior, but as witness. The lights dimmed. For a moment, the room became a cathedral of quiet. Then Leia placed her hand on the strings and struck a single chord. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. But it was hers. A sound born from 6 years of silence, steady and soft, filling the space like sunrise through fog. The audience leaned forward breathless, as if afraid to miss a single vibration. When the melody grew, Caleb joined her. 2 instruments, 1 heartbeat. Evelyn watched them, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She had spent years trying to control life, to force healing, to buy peace. And yet here it was, unbought, unplanned, undeserved. Leia turned toward her mother midway through the song. Their eyes met, the same hazel shade, the same history of grief. And as the final note trembled in the air, Leia whispered into the microphone, voice clear and calm. "For my dad, for the music he left behind." The audience stood, not clapping, just standing. Because some moments are too sacred for noise. After the performance, Evelyn stepped outside. The night was cold, the harbor glittering under the moon. Caleb joined her, his guitar case slung across his back. "She's special," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded, smiling through tears. "She gets that from her father." Then after a pause she looked at him. "And from you." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. "I just played along." They stood there for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of children laughing inside. The kind of laughter that heals the air itself. "You were right," Evelyn finally said. "About what?" "That sometimes listening is enough." He looked at her, eyes steady, kind. "And sometimes," he said, "it's everything." Inside, Leia had returned to the stage. She sat cross-legged, tracing waves on the wooden floor with chalk. The same curved lines she once drew for Caleb long ago. Beside the wave, she wrote a single word: music. Evelyn watched through the window, heart swelling with a peace she hadn't known in years. No applause, no speeches, no cameras. Just the soft hum of life beginning again. The city lights reflected off the glass, turning tears into stars. And in that quiet, Evelyn Hart finally understood. Silence had never been her daughter's prison. It had been her own. Some stories end with applause. But the truest ones end in silence. The kind that listens back. Evelyn Hart once believed that money could fix what grief had broken. Caleb Turner believed music could only remind him of loss. And yet between them, a child taught the world something sacred. That sound is only half of hearing. The rest is love. So if you ever meet someone who speaks without words, don't rush to answer. Pause. Listen. Because somewhere in that silence, a voice is waiting to be heard.